Welcome to The Human Edge. This week's guest is the renowned novelist Amanda Craig. So there were ambulances going past outside, there were helicopters flying above. That might come through in the recording, but please persevere. It was an amazing conversation, all about creativity, the insecurities that writers and other creatives go through during the process. I loved it. I hope you do too. And if you do, please like, please share, please subscribe. It would be massively helpful. Thank you. Before we started filming, you were telling me you were writing again, writing your
I'm
new
always
novel.
writing.
Always
Yes,
writing.
yes,
Do you ever have a day off?
Well, not really. I don't even have a night off because when I'm really in the middle of writing, as I am now, I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and my mind is going like the clappers, and I think, oh, that's what I need to do next, or that's what I've missed out.
Yeah.
And it's very exhausting. It sounds ridiculous because, of course, usually you're working at home or in a nice cafe like this one.
Yeah.
And it's not like going and working on a factory floor or even in an office. But in another sense, it is real work, and it's really tiring, and you don't get a lot of break. Right now, I'm focusing just on you, but if I was chatting to my husband, I might well be off having another conversation in parallel in my head with, one of my characters.
Well,
so,
and I know that feeling very well.
From your wife,
from my
a
wife.
very distinguished novelist.
Yeah, that's right. Is writing for you a compunction? Is it something that you can't live without?
Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, it's a whole lot of things. It's a vocation, so you feel you just must do it. It's the reason why you're here. But it's also a terrible curse because, 9 days out of 10, you're pretty miserable. I've compared it to dragging a grand piano out of a bog. It's such an effort, and it's so ridiculous. And a lot of people can't understand why you do this, because they particularly can't understand why you put all this effort into making stuff up. Why don't you write non-fiction? And a lot of men, particularly now, feel that there's no point to it. But when you get it right, or when you read something, I think all proper writers must start as passionate and engaged and curious readers. It's just the best thing in the world, and it's like meeting a friend that you never knew you had. And for me, when I meet readers who've really loved my work, which you do sometimes out of the blue. I was once in the middle of having a very intimate gynecological examination, and I was lying in the most undignified position imaginable, and the doctor said, "Are you Amanda Craig, the novelist? I do so enjoy your..." It was horrific. She meant well, but it was not what you wanted.
Yeah. She could have waited until
until I didn't have the metal thing inside me. But it was, very well intended.
Yeah.
And then, you meet people at literary festivals and bookshops. And, I myself am a huge fan of a lot of other writers too. So you do have that sense of a kind of communion which sustains you. And to me, that and the craft, are the reasons for being a writer. It's not, as I'm afraid far too many people now seem to think, being published, getting money. Money's almost non-existent now. Being famous, such as, there isn't really any fame unless you're J.K. Rowling these days.
And most people wouldn't want that.
And most people wouldn't that level of it either, no. So, it's a very weird niche thing. Of course, 100 years ago, it was the only show in town. And that's quite sad to reflect on how that's changed. But 200 years ago, being a poet was the only change in it, and 300 years ago, being a priest. So, this is just part of a general societal ferment.
And if it's, I don't know if you think about things, but in a further 100 years' time,
who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? Because where we were 10 or so years ago, the film and television industry and newspapers now are, they're being absolutely eviscerated by the internet. So who knows? But then sometimes people can rediscover things.
Yeah.
You can't be too desperately miserable about that. Although, of course, we all are.
Yeah. How did you discover your gift in the first place?
Really, because I've always read as long as I can remember. Although originally, up until I was about 13, what I wanted to do was be a doctor, because part of this vocation, in a way, is to want to touch people, to help people, to help heal people.
Yeah.
And I do think that a really good novel does help to do that. It does, either on an individual level or perhaps on a more group level. I don't know. There are lots of different kinds of audiences.
Do you set out to do that? Is that a kind of an intentional desire when beginning a book?
No, in the very beginning of a book, I have this kind of pulse of an idea that that's it, that's the thing I must follow. I was trying to think how to describe this. There's a very wonderful Victorian children's book, which I wish more people knew, called The Princess and the Goblin. And it's got a child heroine who's given this magic ring by her very mysterious and magical great-great-great-grandmother. And this ring doesn't make you disappear or fly away to a nice hot country. What it does is when you're in danger, you must take it off and follow this invisible thread wherever it takes you and know that it will take you somewhere safer. And the most dramatic part of this novel is when this little girl who lives in a land which is full of goblins who want to kidnap and possibly kill her is very frightened and does this. And this thread that she cannot see takes her into the depths of a mountain where she's totally blind and she just has to follow it and follow it and follow it with her finger. And in doing so, she rescues the hero from the goblins, and it's all very, very exciting. But it is very like that. Different people have different ways of writing, but mine is like that. I wish it were like the way that writing is shown in Hollywood, where you have one of these huge boards and you write out all these things, and then you somehow mysteriously the book is written. Or it's just somehow miraculously these pages that mount up. No, it's not like that. It's totally bloody terrifying. All you have is the conviction that this story is worth telling, and that somehow you'll find the way out of the mountain.
Yeah, your to carry on with your imagery, your
metaphor.
You're groping blindly in the dark.
Yeah, but you do have this tiny thread that you can't see, but you've got to sort of do it.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is in that metaphor. I don't know where I'm taking this, but you're going outside of yourself to find it. But of course, the work is inside.
The work is inside.
Always.
Yeah, and the danger is you feel it's kind of quite physical.
Yeah.
I definitely have physical responses to things that I write and also to things that I read. I mean, and I think that's power, to make people, cry, to make people keep reading. I mean, one of the best compliments I ever had was this incredibly distinguished writer on the FT who was going into surgery, and she was reading one of my books, quite an early one called A Private Place, and the anaesthetist kept saying, "Come on now, this, you've got to go under now, 10, 9, 8. No, she said, I just want to read another. I want to get to the end of the chapter." And that, I think, is part of what I want to do, as well as all the other more kind of literary, aesthetic things about writing. It's that thing.
You want to move people.
You want to move people, you want to take them out of themselves, you know.
It's quite a responsibility at the same time. Is that part of the struggle?
Well, I try not to think about that, but I am aware, because of some of the things that I write about, for instance, racism and crime and coercive control. You know, I mean, they're sort of really quite nasty subjects, but wrapped up in all sorts of other things. I mean, I am aware that people can perhaps be moved in the wrong way. Sometimes readers can completely misunderstand what I've written, but that's up to them. Yes, I try to be clear. I have found, and I'm surprised more people don't do this, that writing an afterword about what gave me the idea for this book and what I'm actually doing has helped a lot with critical reception. Because one of the other things I do is, you know, I am a satirist, and that's always quite dangerous. And I had my very first novel, Foreign Bodies, which was written in the first person. I was more or less straight out of university, and I thought, it's so obvious that this is comedy. It's so obvious that this is a heroine you're not supposed to like. You know, this was quite a revolutionary thing in the 1990s, let me tell you. God, it was a nightmare, because, you know, there were all sorts of critics who reviewed it as if this character was me. So that was a complete nightmare. You know.
And I'm assuming that most people assume about a writer's work that what they're writing about is somehow autobiographical.
Yeah, and that's a very, very tricky area, because obviously there are things that you only know about because you've been through certain experiences. Yeah. I mean, I would argue that, for instance, childbirth is one of those things. You know, childbirth, I think I've actually said this in a novel, is the female equivalent of going into battle. You know, you're terrifically wounded physically and mentally. It takes a long time to get over. I think practically everyone, no matter how much you love a child and you desperately want a baby, I think there are millions of women with post-traumatic stress disorder after going through it. And I think that level of suffering and joy, you cannot really fully imagine without going through it. I mean, I may be wrong, but you know, that's my view. But there are lots of other things that I have imagined that have not happened to me. You know, often I will go and research a book very, very thoroughly, as if because I was also a journalist in my 20s, as if I was doing a kind of long form journalism, and that is very helpful and good. And I'm a great believer in contemporary fiction writers doing that. And to me, it's very much what the great novelists, not just Dickens, but Balzac and Zola and so on, did too.
Yes, if you don't do the research, you don't...
It won't feel real.
No, that's right. And so you were going on to say that you're now writing afterwards so that, to mitigate the danger, I suppose, of critics taking the novel the wrong way.
Yeah, I think it just helps to kind of step outside this world you've created and say, okay, this is what gave me the idea, this is what it's about, and there are also often a lot of people you want to thank because, because of all this research and so on. And I have noticed that I think my critical reception is not just that I hope, got better, but that, people have actually understood better what it is I'm writing. Yeah. And, of course, the other thing now is that reviewers, critics are paid so little that there are a lot of them who just don't have the time to invest in reading, I'm afraid, very thoroughly, or even the whole book.
Yeah.
And it just makes it less likely that they'll kind of skip the really important bit that they shouldn't skip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you become over the years more sanguine about the bad review or the? I don't know if you've ever been eviscerated, but
I have been eviscerated. Well, the first one was so terrible. I feel it was like being inoculated against the worst.
Yeah.
No, I have, and I do sometimes get very cross, and I have to kind of step away from Twitter because I'm so cross. But I mean, mostly I have lovely reviews, and that's wonderful. But
are you like many or in most creatives that you may get 99 wonderful reviews, but it's the 100th,
one awful one.
one.
You remember?
Yeah.
A bit. I mean, you do kind of have to grow a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth skin to carry on.
Yeah.
And it just goes with the territory. I mean, I think it depends how recently you've finished a book. That's the other thing, because also when I began, there was, you would finish a book and it would come out like 4 to 6 months later.
Yeah.
It was much faster. Now, because I'm something called a super lead, which means you're one of the sort of big titles at your publisher, and there are only 3 or 4 of those a year, they've got to get you into this whole schedule. It's a bit like aeroplanes landing.
Yeah.
So by the time a book of mine has come out, I'm probably almost a year away from where I was. That has been so helpful psychologically, because you just have that, by then you're onto another book, and it's not like, seeing your newborn baby roasted by demons over the open flames.
Is it that bad?
Well, I'm exaggerating, but, there is one critic I will forever hate, let us say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it also more difficult to talk about a book 12 months later when you're in the middle of something else?
No, not particularly. Particularly not in my case, because I do something that, again, is very much something I learnt from the great Victorians, which is I carry characters on from one book to the next. So you don't have to have read the other ones, although you'll enjoy each one more and more the more you do know about the background. So minor characters become major and major characters become minor. Okay. So I'm always living with this now really quite big cast of people. Yeah. I mean, I haven't actually counted how many, but there must be about 60.
Wow.
So, yeah.
How do you... 60 people living in your head?
Yeah.
I don't know what the question is, though, but that's the cognitive load that must require. So how do you do that? How do you keep a track of?
Well, it's partly like being a conductor. Yeah. How does a conductor know this is where, or composer, this is where the violins come in, this is where the piano takes over.
It's a nice analogy. That helps me.
It's really helpful. I mean, I wouldn't advise it as a strategy. It's completely bonkers. But as I said, I'm not wholly in control of this whole thing. Yeah. I mean, there are people who are very, very good writers who are completely the opposite, who plot and plan and, they've got a whole scheme and so on. And it works. And it works, in some cases absolutely beautifully. I mean, I love those plans that are like clockwork, that just all, work. But, mine work too, but I'm kind of working very hard not to be utterly predictable.
Yes.
Which is the danger with the clockwork.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I want to talk to you about the insecurities, the vulnerabilities of being a creative person, being a writer. But I'm going to I'm warning you.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm going to put them to one side for the moment, because I'm also curious about the state of the publishing industry. So, we're talking 25 years, right, from the early 90s to where we are.
35.
35, I can't do my maths.
I've been doing it for ages and ages, yeah.
So how have you seen things change in that period of time? And kind of second question, would you recommend people to go into the profession as a writer today?
To become a writer?
Yeah.
Well, let me talk first about how it's changed. So when I first began, it was very much like the way that I think a lot of people still think it is. So it was like a kind of lovely cottage industry full of people who were rather kind of gentlemanly and Oxbridge, and many of whom had private incomes, all very sweet, definitely snobby, very white, definitely middle, if not upper middle class, all centred around Bloomsbury and Soho. And I have to say, as someone who is white, Oxbridge, middle class, I felt very at home there. But what then happened was partly because of, more and more of the publishers becoming conglomerates. You've now got, I think it's a big 4, or is it a big 5, where with lots of imprints that were independents that have all been amalgamated. And some of that is dire because you've lost a lot of editorial independence. I mean, basically the commissioning editors, the ones who read a book and think this is great, have lost power, and the marketing people who have to sell the book have massively gained it. But, and that's why you get lots of books, one of the reasons why you get more and more identikit books that are just kind of clones of each other, a bit like what's happened in the high street and in Hollywood. So that is very bad, I think, creatively, and it's a real struggle for the editors who really are gifted and have a huge impact on what you write. But I'm also very pro-business, and I do see that publishing has become a lot more professional as a result of this. So you get much better, I think, meticulous copy editing than you used to, certainly than I had 35 years ago. Everything from your spelling to the fact-checking. Americans are very keen on fact-checking, so lots of that has come along, and that is good.
Despite the political landscape, when facts don't seem to matter at all.
Yes, well, that's a whole other thing. But, by and large, I think that's good. And I think it's good for people and for authors who can be, I regret to say, a bit airy-fairy and entitled, to be reminded that this is a business, that people have put money into this, that they will lose if your book, is bought and it doesn't sell, or it actually loses them lots of money. And I think that is a very salutary thing to constantly remind yourself that, it's not just that, you have written this wonderful book. It's that up to about 7 people have put their careers on the line to publish your book. So you bloody well better have a degree of humility and, be able to work cooperatively with these people who actually usually do know what they're talking about in their areas. And I think that's very good and important.
I know there was a second element to the question, but are people, the general public, reading novels as much as they used to?
Well, again, this is a very interesting question, because before the pandemic, there was a terrible feeling that, fiction was dying on its feet, particularly literary fiction, which is what I write. And the only thing that was working was non-fiction and celebrity biography, or autobiography as it's called. It hardly ever is written by the celebrity, of course. And then in lockdown, people suddenly had this extra 2 hours of leisure and in many cases a bit more time, and fiction just exploded. I mean, my sales, I think, probably doubled.
Wow.
Which was fantastic. It was also because we decided, me and my very brave, lovely publisher, Richard Bezick, decided to publish, I think it was the week, if not the week after, the first lockdown ended, and we were really rewarded for that, which was, people were flocking to bookshops.
Yes.
Heaven. Now it's not so rosy. So it goes up and down. Now everybody seems very terrified and fixated on TikTok or BookTok. Again, this may well pass. Of course, Book Talk has also just rediscovered some fantastic writers that had not sold. I mean, Wendy Cope, the poet, has suddenly zoomed into, I think, something like 1 million sales because a book talker said this is wonderful, witty, and all the things that those of us who read poetry knew.
Yeah.
And I couldn't be happier about that. So, it's not all doom and gloom, but it's so much a matter of luck.
Yeah, which brings us on to the second part of the question. If there was let me ask it this way: if an 18-year-old Amanda Craig came to you and said, "This is what I want to do for my profession," what would you say? What would the advice be?
Well, I actually said that. Sorry to name drop here, but to Graham Greene, who was the most hideous old snob, and he turned on me with sort of empurpled rage and said, "How can you possibly say that? How can you possibly know that? Nobody should write a book until they're at least 30," he said, probably 40. And the thing is, now I know why he reacted like that, but it was very cruel, and I've never forgotten it. In fact, it just made me more determined.
Yes.
I think that, it is fantastically risky. I mean, everything in the creative business, saying you want to play in a band is terribly risky. Saying you want to paint or act, it's the odds against you, not just succeeding, but just simply making enough to live on are gigantic. You've probably got a 0.1% chance of success. And what is amazing, I think, certainly in this country, is that despite huge philistinism, especially from successive governments, it's not just a Tory Labour thing. All of them, they don't read, they don't, dreadful. There is still this extraordinary, counter-cultural spirit, and people do still go into it, which I think is fantastic. What worries me is that people don't see also that they need to support it. Yeah. So I'm always very impressed, for instance, when I go to the theatre, particularly the opening week, by the number of really famous actors who turn out to support other actors. And an awful lot, I suspect, of hardback fiction, which is the thing that, much more than anything else, Kindles, forget it, that gives you 10p. Hardback fiction is a thing that really keeps you alive. If you sell pathetically small, I think it's 1,500 hardbacks, you are the most wonderful patron of the arts that can be imagined, because it's that money from the hardback that enables the author and the publisher to keep going.
Wow, that few.
Not that few, but it's absolutely critical. And now that hardbacks are, and please buy them from a bookshop, not Amazon. Now that, because the bookshops sell at the recommended retail price, Amazon, because it's so big and so powerful and so Trumpian, basically demands these enormous discounts. That means it's basically like buying a second-hand paperback by the time it comes through to you. Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to write, for example, absolutely write, but
have a job.
Yeah, but have a job as well.
Yeah. And you'll be a better writer, I think, for doing that. I mean, I was incredibly lucky in that when I began, I rode two horses, which was journalism and fiction. And in those days, you could do that. You could get a mortgage. You can't imagine that now. And there are no jobs in journalism anymore. Maybe 2 a year on a staff. And there's no money in freelancing. People are paid now what I was paid when I was a young journalist in the mid-1980s. And that's shocking.
That is shocking.
Really, really shocking. Yeah. Which is roughly about between £200 and £700 for an article that's probably taking you a week. So you can't live on that.
Yeah.
So that's why I would say don't do it. Having said which, my lovely daughter, Leon, is publishing her first novel this autumn. Well, thank you. It does feel a bit like a kind of crack of doom time because, she knows better than most people, and she's also worked as a young publisher.
Yeah.
She's probably never going to make a living from it.
Yeah.
So she's got to do something else as well.
Yeah. But in my mind, I'm coming back to one of the first questions I asked you. Is it a compunction?
Yeah.
And if you're creatively minded like that, you have to do it. So, but in order to live, you also have to.
You also have to do something else.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's utterly unpredictable whether what you do will ever make any money. I mean, there's a lovely friend of mine who's extremely distantly related to this very famous Jewish family called the Modianos, who were, the name sort of changed, but they were one of the ancestors of Modigliani, the famous painter. And they were like the Rothschilds of Eastern Europe, unbelievably wealthy. And all he wanted to do, instead of going into the family bank, was to paint. And his family said, no, don't paint in your spare time. Just go into the bank. You'll have a wonderful life. And he said, no, just give me the smallest room, the maid's room in your palazzo in Venice, so I can paint. And now their enormous family fortune is totally gone. There's not one penny left. But a Modigliani is worth millions and millions and millions. And wonderfully, towards the end of his life, when he got taken up by Peggy Guggenheim, he became very, very rich thanks to this patron. There are things that you cannot predict.
Yes.
And every time I hear about, who's that fantastic rapper who was at school just up here in Ackland Burley? Stormzy.
Did he go to Burley?
Yeah, he went to Ackland Burley.
That.
And, I think he's absolutely wonderful man because, he's funded scholarships to Cambridge. He seems to be genuinely interested in bringing up the next generation of musicians. That is a star.
Yeah, you'll have to talk to Dwayne off air because Dwayne, our sound engineer. Hello, Dwayne. Works on some Stormzy gigs.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool. Right.
But you also talked about Italy. I love the segue that we're about to move into because Italy is clearly a big influence on your life and your work, which is curious to me because you're known as a state of the nation writer, and you write most or many of your books are set here in London, which is a huge influence. But yet. You lived for a long time in Italy.
Thing.
Yeah.
Well, how it came about is so I was born in South Africa, and my parents were journalists, and they absolutely hated apartheid, particularly my mum. So they got out after the Sharpeville massacre, very famous, hideous massacre.
And how old were you at the time?
I was just a baby in arms, and my mother said, "I don't want to bring up a child in this dreadful country." And it was a real wrench because, if you were a white person and you had a job and everything, you had a fantastic life. And the kind of life that my dad, who came from County Durham, had certainly not been born into. So, to have a maid who was, wonderful. And, of course, they were little better than slaves. And my mum could see this. He did see it, but it wasn't so clear. Anyway, she's the driving force of the family. So they got out, and she'd always loved Italy, and she studied Renaissance art and so on. So they went briefly to Italy, then to London. So my very first memories are really of Primrose Hill, which then it's hard to believe now, a very run-down part of North London, that kind of other...
And now how very literary.
And now nobody literally can afford it anymore. But, it's been through all these... that's what's fascinating about London, how it changes completely. But, they then... And she then had my sister. And in the middle of one of the worst winters, i.e. 1963... when everything froze, it was famously dreadful winter. My dad had flu. He was rung up by this fantastic man called James Cameron, not James Cameron, the film director, but James Cameron, who was a great journalist and very kind to a younger journalist. And he said, there's a job going in Italy at the UN. They want someone who is a journalist to run their press office. Are you interested? Were they interested? Yeah. They shot off faster than you could see, practically. Yes. So that's how I came to have my kind of Italian childhood, because they lived there then for 50 years. And my dad died there. And my mum only left because she got too elderly. She's still alive. She's 97.
Wow.
I know, going to be 98 this September. Now living in London with my sister. But so I had this long love of and association with Italy, and also the UN. So this is where this other strand of my being, really interested in other cultures, other countries, because I saw things because of my dad's job. He did a lot of work. Right at the end, he did the Ethiopian famine, but there were terrible things going on all through that period. And I was literally seeing these little children in the Congo and so on, and saying, but Daddy, how can these kids, my age, how can they be starving? Because they've got big tummies on them. And he explained, when you've got nothing in your stomach, it fills up with gas. And I was so horrified. And just more than anything, it was the photographs that I saw that, perhaps I was a bit young to see. So that was this very strong friction in my life. That on the one hand, Rome was also really nice especially if you're employed by the UN, because although Italy was having that Dolce Vita expansion. So we were living in this lovely apartment right next to the on the Aventine Hill. We had a cardinal living in the basement. We had a film star living next door with incredible parties. There were this kind of mind-bending. There are various films about that period. That was quite like that life. There's beautiful Roman ruins, the cafes, the glamour, the fashion, and so on. And then there was the work my dad was doing at the UN with these people who could not have been more different. So I think from that comes my kind of mission to try and write about, all the different stratas of a society. I'm very impatient. I know I shouldn't be, because people write what they know. But I do get very fed up with writing which is just about, white middle-class people. That's not enough, particularly not in Britain and particularly London now. So in my most recent novel that's published, The Three Graces, which is set in Tuscany, the main characters, the three octogenarian herons of the title, they are, white, middle class, professional. They've had, they're having the lovely side of Italy, but there is this whole other side, this other plot about people trafficking from North Africa, with which the novel begins with a man shooting what is indeed an illegal immigrant from Africa out of his bedroom window, because Italians feel, rightly or wrongly, they are on the front line of an enormous migration into Europe, and that a lot of them are absolutely terrified and furious, as more and more countries are all over the world. So that really interests me, that clash between different kinds of lives and morality, and who is right, who is wrong. There's one point where one of the three herons says, do you know why on a lifeboat there's an axe? And her mixed race grandson says, is it to cut down palm trees if you're, on a desert island? She said, no, that axe is there so you chop off the hands of people who want to come on board your lifeboat, because if they come on, enough of them come on board, their lifeboat will sink. I actually heard someone say this. Someone who knew about lifeboats. And, it's so horrible. But we've got to talk about this stuff.
Yeah. I was wondering earlier whether, thinking about your kind of background in your life, so being transplanted early, moving to Italy, where presumably you didn't speak the language.
Well, I learnt it quite fast, as you do as a child. Yeah.
Whether there's an element of you being always an outsider where you've been, but I'm wondering, it feels to me now it's more of an observer than an outsider.
Yes, both of those things. I feel both an outsider and an insider. As a white middle class Oxford blah de blah person, of course I'm an insider. Of course, I know how the elite works, how the establishment works, the people you can call, the buttons you can press, and I'm both enormously grateful for that and filled with guilt and loathing. But I do know also about the other sides. I have, contrary to appearances, I do know what it's like to be so poor that you're hungry. I know what it's like to wake up every day in absolute terror you're going to lose the roof over your head. I did have that experience too in my early 20s. I know what it's like to do really shit jobs. Again in my early 20s, I have had some lumps.
Do those experiences also fire the desire to write about? The other side?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, I get very angry when people assume that all fiction is autobiographical, because it really isn't. But obviously it comes from these experiences. And I'm very lucky to have that. I know what it's like to be the poorest person in a room, and I also know what it's like to be the richest person in the room, although I wouldn't say myself I'm rich, but then people are always, as I say in another novel, they're always looking at the sort of ladders in the rung ahead of them rather than beneath them. But I think it's really, really important to see that stuff that's down below, those people who are living and suffering and struggling and who have just as much right as you do to be there.
Yeah, to be happy.
And to be happy and to have a life, all those things. I think it's very easy, particularly at the moment when, we've had a change of government, people were very hopeful that things would get better, and they don't seem to be. And the despair, especially among the younger generations that I pick up, is very real and very, very troubling.
Changing tack again. I'm not sure why this is popping into my head, but I feel like I want to ask it. So when you're writing, you're in your own world, and you're in your own world for a long time in the day. But you're also a mum. And I'm wondering, of course, kids want attention, right? Kids want their parents to be present with them. And that is especially difficult when you're consumed with what you're writing, with the 60 characters in your head. Not so many at that point in time, but you know what I mean. So can you speak to what it was like for you, and what it maybe still is like for you being a mum, having your kids who really want your attention, but yet being somewhere else at the same time?
Well, I used to joke that, unless you've got a fever or you've got a broken leg, you're not allowed to disturb me at a certain time. It's really hard. And for many, many years, I was writing in the interstices of my life, in the sort of spare moments. I have to say it was not as hard as being a freelance journalist. I mean, I vividly remember when my second child, my son, was born, and he was very sick and had a sort of kidney reflux disease, so he was constantly vomiting. And I remember one of the worst days of my life, sitting and having to write, I think it was a leader for a national newspaper, typing. The keys were covered in vomit because I couldn't get up and clean it away. I had 40 minutes in which I had to, just get this piece, and he was howling and howling, and I was typing. I mean, that was just ghastly beyond belief.
And I just wanted to stop, and it's just the most kind of incredible juxtaposition of those stories that you were telling me of life in Rome and the glamour.
Oh yeah, but that was my parents.
I know it's
we were older,
but it's still still different moments of a life, right? And it's
and
it's really
I was very, very lucky, because by the time we had certainly our son, I was able to stop doing quite so much of the journalism, and I've almost stopped it completely now. And I was able to buy help, even just for a couple of hours. For many, many years, everything that I earned went to buying help. Just even if it was 2 hours a day, it made a difference.
Was there still an element of guilt around that?
No. I would have gone completely crazy if I hadn't had that. And I think it's more stimulating for a child. I mean, if you get a nice mother's help, they get taken out to the park and
I always say this about being a parent. We need time to ourselves to be better
Yes,
parents.
and I think this is the other awful thing. I mean, we are in the middle now of, just despite all this stuff about immigration, we have an absolute baby desert. We've got to start having more children, making it easier for people to have children. I think for most of humanity, people have had their family to help them, their tribe. Now we're living these appallingly atomized lives in which families are, physically distant from each other or couldn't care less. And that is awful. And that was another problem, was that, my parents were in another country, and my husband's parents, they're very, very lovely and willing to help. By the time we had children, they had health crises of their own. So, we had to be able to buy that. And that's something that a lot of people just don't have. And in other countries, the state will provide really fantastic, good, nurturing nursery care. And I think we have to do that here. But, so yes, I was very much writing in the interstices of my life. I still do a lot of, kind of admin stuff when I'm just walking my dog on the heath, which is very nice. Technology has been hugely helpful.
Yes.
Just, when I first started writing, when I first started doing journalism, you would have to physically bring in your typed copy of a story. And again, that was on a deadline. So that was incredibly stressful. And then, when fax machines arrived, hallelujah, you didn't have to go into an office to do it. And that seemed amazing. And then the internet, and then the mobile phone. That was, all of these things have been massively helpful. I can't remember how we started this.
Well, yes, that's the beauty of these conversations. No, I was asking about motherhood.
Oh, motherhood. Yeah, it's very tough. But the interesting thing is that I think, particularly women writers, women, certainly a lot of female creatives who didn't have to perform on a stage, be physically present. They've always tried to make it work with children. Because the great thing is about children, as long as you don't have too many of them, is that they do grow up. They do start being able to. So I was, always just shoving books at my kids and getting them to read as soon as possible, because once they got addicted to books, and it was books rather than DVDs, although the DVDs did come along.
And then
So that was a big
they're
help.
in their own world, and you're allowed
They're
to go
in
back
their
into
own
your
world,
yeah.
and it's very important. And these days, my children are always kind of pushing me away. No, Mum, I'm grown up. I don't need you to oversee everything, to curate everything. So I probably did actually too much of when I was around.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's nobody. No parent gets it completely right, even the best. And I think, you have to kind of just hope that you're forgiven for the many things you get wrong, and that you do end up actually liking as well as loving each other.
Yeah, I think that's every parent's desire.
Yeah. Well, I think people now are more and more enlightened about parenthood. But, as I said, I'm just really sad and anxious for the millennials and Gen Z, although they're a bit young for that, who just think they can't have a child because, we couldn't afford a child when we had our first one. Our baby was sleeping in a drawer lined with a blanket. That's how broke we were. But, it's amazing how once this little person arrives, you just work twice as hard. Even if you thought you were working hard, you will just do anything to do it. And it works. Or it did.
Yes. Yeah. So I seeded this a little while ago with you, but this podcast is called The Human Edge for a reason, because I
love.
Good
name.
Yes, thank you. I love exploring with my guests what makes us human. The world is full of division at the moment, and we need to remember more than ever that we are all, no matter where we come from, what we do, we're all so much more alike than we are different. And one of the things that binds us as human beings, I think, is the insecurities, the vulnerabilities that we don't often show to the outside world.
Yeah.
And I know from living with a writer that there are plenty of insecurities and vulnerabilities involved in the creative process. One of the things I'm curious about is how, when you're writing, how do you know what you're writing is any good? Is that a constant?
Ooh, that's a really good question.
Constant refrain for you.
No. You must learn how to become what I think is called a defended personality. At least while you're doing this, because and about 90% of the energy of creating something is taken up by keeping that wall up, by not allowing those thoughts through. Because if you did, I mean, of course you're still working, that's never far away. But if you allow that to touch your core, you're finished. Yes. You can't do it. And there are days when I have that. Everybody I think has that. And you just have to grit your teeth and keep going and keep going. And very often I will have days in which the whole day has been spent writing and rewriting the same damned paragraph that somehow, you're like a chicken with a chalk line. You just can't move your head from it. And then at 6 o'clock, just when it's time to do supper, it suddenly comes. Yes. And there's this kind of wonderful burst of 1,000 words, which is what you should try and do every day.
Yeah. That's the magic number.
The magic number. It's really hard. And, in the days when you could think, well, I've just got to do this, I've got to finish this book, and then it'll be a bestseller, or I'll get, at least I'll get £50,000 or something like that. That must have been so much easier, because that's another kind of thing that makes it more tolerable is money. Now there is no money. There's no money. There's usually no fame. There's no good reception. So it's really tough to keep going. But if that is your thing, you have to keep doing it. And try not to become a monster. Try not to be full of self-pity. Try not to be such a defended personality that you come across as terribly arrogant. This is something that, in my observation, male writers have particularly. That they're so kind of, they think they've got to behave like novelists in American films. So they've got to go and get drunk and have fights and live in the south of France. And I mean, you could just have a list. It's so ludicrous. Yeah. But more than anything, there's this terrible arrogance, and that has become a real thing for them.
But this is coming from a place of fear and defensiveness.
But this is, ultimately it is coming from a place of fear and defensiveness, and you can know that as a fellow writer, but still be so irritated by it. As on the whole, women tend to be more supportive and collegiate of each other, probably because that's what we've been socialised to be.
What's it like finishing a book and then handing over your baby for public consumption? That to me is almost the kind of the apex of vulnerability, because it's, as we said before, when you're creating something, it's coming from inside. Right? And so it's like almost, here's a part of my soul, here's a part of my being for everybody to read and.
Well, this is why, if, as I've been lucky enough to do, you get a really wonderful editor and publisher, you're just on a different level. I had 2 or 3, I'm afraid, absolutely crap editors before Richard Beswick, wonderful Richard, because they know that. They're very kind of sensitive and nurturing, but also incredibly tough. I mean, one of the reasons I love my editor is that he says, yes, very funny, good, boring, and that's very tough to hear that, but it's what you need to hear, because if your editor says that, so will thousands of other readers. They'll get turned off, and I think this is just not worth my while. So you've got to listen when somebody says, no, this bit is boring, this bit needs to be cut. And I think it's one of the big divisions, and I'm sure it's the case in music and film and so on and so on. You've got to listen to it, because the one thing you mustn't do is be a bore.
Yes.
People are not paying their good money for you to bore them.
Yeah.
And for you.
Is it almost better that people hate your work than be bored by your work?
Yes, or hate a bit of it and then come through that. And then I think that can be wonderful, that you sort of, you're really riled up by something, and then you think, oh no, hang on, I was meant to feel this, and you come out the other side, and that can be, really fantastic. It is very difficult, and you are kind of vulnerable, but it's one thing that experience will teach you, that you just sort of have to, it's part of the process. I mean, I did have one friend, bless him, who, had tried for years and years to write a novel, and finally wrote it, and finally was getting it published, and he had a dream the month of publication. This is very rather rude, but that he'd produced a turd the size of a battleship. And he went to his mother, who's a very nice woman, and she said, darling, don't worry, it's wonderful. And the trouble was, it was a turd.
Oh, no.
It really was. And his subconscious was telling him something that, he knew, but he just so wanted to be published.
Yeah.
Anyway, and probably the first thing you write won't be your best thing. It's a huge misfortune if the very first book you have published, or like the very first song you have recorded, or the first picture you have exhibited is your best.
Yes.
Because this
second album syndrome, or whatever.
No, second album. But if you seem to be a huge success from, I mean, there are various people I could mention, but I won't. If your debut is a huge success, you will probably never have that again, ever, and you will spend the rest of your life in misery trying to repeat it. If, like me, you start off in misery and shame and mortification, you have to work really hard to overcome that and to get better. Yeah. And, that's what will happen. You will get better. You will, dig deeper into yourself to produce the stuff that then people find they really love. So,
what's the next? I mean, so you've gone through that arc, the right way round, hopefully.
well, I hope. Yeah.
But is there another frontier to come? Is there a part of you that still comes up against the edge of the title of the podcast? Where
Yeah. No, all the time. You're trying to create better characters, create sort of deeper storylines, to also not be afraid of being more serious. Because I said that what you mustn't do is bore your audience, but that can make you too much of I'm entertaining you, I'm being funny, I'm making all these jokes, and actually, really, what people like from an art is something that really speaks to them at their deepest. And to get to that place, you have to do a lot of work, and be a lot bolder about saying what you think about, the human condition and suffering and injustice and so on.
Are you saying that? Are you still holding back to a degree?
Well, I am a bit. I mean, I'm trying to do this balance. So this novel that I'm writing now, which I'm tremendously involved in and excited by, but it's basically about a group of writers in a cafe who are under siege from a riot, a really sort of hideous riot in which some people have already been murdered, and so they're all doing initially being kind of very self-absorbed, quite sort of ludicrous writers, and then they have to really decide who they are. Are they going to protect someone who's hiding from this terrible cataclysm outside? Are they going to give them up? This is actually a child who's being hunted by a county lines gang. And one of the things this is modelled on is a film I absolutely love that not everybody knows, which is John Carpenter's Assault on Precinct 13. And I think that's a fantastic film because it's hugely entertaining and quite mysterious, because you're not... I mean, it is a sort of revenge plot, but these people have to take in this man in this almost abandoned police station who's being hunted by a gang, and they're all going to die if unless they give him up, they think. And yet they decide they are going to fight back. Now, I mean, that is, really exciting, but it's also very profound about the human condition. And some of the people who are fighting back with the police are convicts. So, and the convicts have this choice, which is even worse, which is, do they stay on the side of right and help the innocent, or do they make a run for it? And in America, that is no small thing.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's no small thing anywhere.
Are you ever kind of overtaken by a thought that's too close to the bone? I can't go there, or I can't say that.
What, because of what's really happening?
No, maybe it's your own perception of maybe it's too maybe it's. I'm not sure where I'm going with it. Maybe it's too close to the bone of what's actually happening, or maybe it's an opinion of yours that is you're too fearful to voice.
No, I'm not afraid of voicing opinions. What has been a bit more of a battle is that one of the things that I do address repeatedly is racism. And I've got a hero who has appeared now in, sort of definitely in 2 novels. The Lie of the Land, which was a novel about a London family that moves to the countryside just when Brexit is happening. And The Three Graces has this young man, as he is now when you first meet, who's mixed race. So he's half British and half Nigerian. And, I had to be very careful to talk to people who did have that kind of heritage. And I did ask for a sensitivity reader, but, there was not a problem. Because there has been this idea, which I think is completely Philistine and wrong, that if you're not from
Yes.
the same background, you're not allowed to write about that. To me, that's the absolute antithesis of what art should be doing, which is both the artist and the audience should be kind of really thinking about these things and thinking, what is our common humanity and how is someone's experience likely to be very different from mine. But, that's, sometimes, and then to go into the head of someone who's racist, who's looking at that person. There were one or two queries of, because I've got a character in The Three Graces who is Italian, who's the man who shoots this fleeing trafficked guy, and to convey what I know is the way that sort of person thinks about, that was. I knew exactly what I was doing, but the reader was saying, "Oh, but how can you put this? This is right." And I was saying, "No, but that's in his head. That's him. That's not me." And I was very relieved that I didn't get pushback from that. I mean, the great Black American novelist Colson Whitehead said, he was so in the middle of the worst bit of that. He said, look, white people can write black people and black people can write white people. All that matters is that you get it right, and that's the thing, to try and get it right.
Yeah. So. And I love that message about the common humanity. It kind of speaks to what we're doing today and what I'm doing with other conversations.
No, I mean, the common humanity, it's just appalling now. People are absolutely convinced that, Britain is horribly racist. And I think it is racist, but I can remember in my childhood, signs of rooms to rent where we're literally saying, no blacks, no Irish.
Yes.
We have progressed from that, which was a very real and horrible thing. And you just have to hope we outgrow it completely. Yeah. I don't think anybody now is beastly to the Irish. And people and Italians themselves don't remember how at the time when they were seen as number 3 in that, they were, it's just hideous, these divisions. They're so stupid.
Yes.
They're so inhumane, wasteful of everything that humans have to offer. It's just kind of batshit.
Yes.
Why is it still going on?
We've got a long way to go, although we've come a long way as well. And that's a note of hope that I want to leave the conversation on. I could talk with you for another hour and a half.
Good.
But
you've
got to get back to your writing, and our time is up here. Amanda, thanks so much for coming in. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Jules. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.